Okay, what I'm working on now is replacing the wheel bearing inside the whole hub assembly, I guess you'd call it. This is the new wheel bearing. They're sold through Beaver Off-Road. And this is a double bearing. There's one bearing on one side, bearing on the other. I'm not sure how well we can see in the camera here, but you can see it's a dual bearing. What this is a dual cone type bearing. Here's the old bearing that was taken out of here. I got kind of ahead because I wasn't able to keep up with time and everything. But this is the old bearing. It kind of fell apart. The inside of the race fell apart. Mainly, the bearing had gone bad. I was getting some wobble in the bearing. If you were able to take the whole hub assembly inside there, and it would have a slight wobble to it. Most of this fell apart when I was pressing it out using the press. That's what we're going to show you is what you need to do to get this out. A couple of things you're going to need is once you get the whole wheel assembly out, is you'll have your hub where your studs are, bolt your wheel. That's going to press down in there. You have your brake rotor. That is, when this is assembled, this is on there like so. Your hub goes through, and this is actually bolted to the hub. And that's kind of the problem with these rotors, is that if you want to do anything with your rotor, you have to press this whole assembly apart. One thing you need is a 14 millimeter wrench, because you're going to need to remove your caliper bracket off your bearing assembly. And we'll get that out of the way. I've already removed that. That's off. And like I said, what I already did is set this up in the press. It's kind of a pain to do. You have to support it underneath because you're going to press through as this is pressed on there. First thing you have to do is you have to take this hub assembly, and what you're going to do is unbolt the rotor so the whole assembly can be put in the press and sit within a rotor, because then you're going to have to press your wheel assembly, your hub assembly with a stud. You have to press that out of the bearing and where that fits through. So you're going to have to press that down through. You're going to have to use either, what I use are some really heavy duty sockets that fit just right on this shaft, because we don't want to damage this shaft, and you need to press that through the bearing. Actually, yes, it's actually better to actually get a piece of pipe that's made just to that size or just slightly undersized. But what you first do is, the way that's in there is, you'll press that through, but the rotor is still going to be attached, as I said. So the whole assembly is going to sit on the press, and you'll press this out of there. And I've already got ahead of myself because I wasn't sure how it was going to come apart, and in the interest of time, I'm trying to get this done. But what we're going to do is show how all this is going to go back together. The other thing is when you press that out, so you won't be able to get to it anyhow, but there's a snap ring that holds the whole bearing assembly inside the bearing housing. And what I'll do is I'll install this back in there right now. Need a nice pair of inside-outside snap ring pliers. And I've already got the new bearing pressed in, so we can get this snap ring installed into place. Grab a screwdriver, fit that down into the groove. Now you have to make sure that you have that assembly all back together, the snap ring in place, deeply into the groove, seated in there, because when we press this through, we want to make sure it's all set, and you won't be able to access it once that's on there. So we're going to press this back in there now, and what I've done is I've put some never sees inside the bearing. The other thing I did is, when this came apart, there was some rust inside the housing between the outside of the bearing. You can see that's pretty black, rusted right there. So what I did is cleaned up inside of the housing. I used 400 grit wet dry sandpaper, and then after that I went to 2000 grit wet dry sandpaper. I used a little oil on there, polished that out really good. The other thing I did is the shaft that's going to go inside there is also that I took with 400 grit sandpaper, because that was quite similar. I had some rust build up on it. I took 400 grit sandpaper and then polished again with 200 grit sandpaper. So what we're going to do is, and also, if you have time when you're taking this whole thing apart and it gets pressed out, if you have someone else do it for you, you probably don't have time. What I've done is, when I was getting ready to do this, this part has been sitting in the freezer, so it will be slightly smaller as it presses in there. It'll allow that to go in. Grab a rag here. That's sweating a little bit from coming out of the freezer. So what I've done is I've already pressed out the old bearing, like I said. This is the old bearing, and you can kind of see how that's a dual bearing setup. The one side of it is, the inner race has been blown out by pressing it out, because you can't really press the bearing the way it fits inside there. You have your outer race, then you have your seal and your inner race. The way it fits in the housing is it sets behind the cast part of the housing. So the outer race is never exposed. So when you press this bearing out of there, you have really no choice, but what you're doing is you're pressing the inner race, and that's kind of I'm going to say pretty hard to get a bearing out of one of these, probably without destroying the bearing. Like I said, now I have the new bearing in place. That's all nice, shiny, good shape. And so we're gonna get this set up so we can press the new bearing in there. I think everything's all set here, polished, everything's clean. Make sure there's no birds on it. Everything's good shape, so it'll press in there good. Like mentioned, I put a little bit of never sees inside there to make sure that when that goes in, that it's not going to rust up like that. So what we're going to do is we're going to get this set up. We'll have to set the rotor on there first. We'll get this set up in a press and start pressing that down. What I'm going to do is that'll go there. I'll have to get my socket that'll press that down with. So we'll get this all set up. We're going to press that in there. What I'm using is just an impact type socket. That'll fit inside, right on top of that, and I can use that to press the whole assembly down. Another good thing is a piece of pipe. If you have one, use a deeper well socket, so that gets me up a little bit higher, sets me up to press a little bit deeper. So I'm going to get this set up into the press. We'll press that bearing, or the wheel assembly, into the bearing housing. And we have the rotor set in place. We can get that set up on there, so we can set this up in the press. Get it centered. Okay, I have that set up, get it into the press, find my handle for the press. I'm going to start pressing that down in there. what I have to do is I'll press it down so far, I'll have to release the press with the movement of the press and the way the studs stick up. So I'm going to press that down in there first. We'll get that pressed into the housing. And then as I go down, you see with everything polished, it's pressing it pretty good in there. And kind of a pretty tight fit, so by sanding the bearing shaft with a 4000 grit sandpaper and then polish, you kind of give it a finishing touch. Now I can check that when I press that through all the way. I want to make sure that that's flush with the other side of the bearing. I don't want to over press it and damage my bearing and put any added pressure on that. So it's not too bad to press that out of there. It's a little harder pressing it out the other way, mainly because it's just accessing it a little bit harder with the roller and getting them set up. But you can see that's pressed back into place. That's nice and smooth. The shaft has come out. There's a slight, the shaft sets down in there slightly because where your axle is going to come in. So that's recessed in there a little bit. Everything's tightened down good. Everything's in good shape. We didn't over press it. We haven't damaged on the bearing. So now what we'll do is as we get this set up, and get this ready to get back in, we can line up our rotor bolts, get those put back into place. Those in, grab a socket for that. I don't really want to use an impact on it because I don't like the threads that are on these assemblies. It'd be pretty easy to strip those threads out. So you want to be careful not to over tighten them. Once all done, I'll tighten them down to, I'm going to say roughly about 40-50 foot-pounds. And everything's hand tight there. I'll go tighten up before I put the whole assembly on. So that's the whole bearing assembly now. That's all mounted on there. What we can do is, now that I have that, as we tighten everything up and everything's all set to go, this is one thing that you got to be very careful of, is your caliper support. These threads are really fine and they're really easy to damage. So you really need to be careful in this aspect of it. Because it's pretty easy to cross thread them, and you don't want to over tighten these very much at all, because it is really easy to over tighten the threads and strip those out. So you want to make sure those are threading down. You don't want to use any kind of an impact gun on this. You want to make sure the threads are lined up. Everything's moving good by hand. The threads aren't tightening up until you get right down to the lock nut. And I'll be all set. I'll be able to tighten this whole assembly up, get that on there. What I'll do is I'll clamp this in the vise. I'll tighten up all my bolts, get all that set to go. Then it'll be ready to put back on in the machine. And then we'll work on, what we'll do is work on getting that all mounted back into the machine, and I'll show you what that takes in just a minute. We're ready to put the wheel assembly back on. The whole bearing assembly, wheel assembly, rotor. What I'll do is use my castle nut. And first, slide this assembly over. Get your axle up, make sure you're not pulling your... And I'll get that on. And just get that nut on, hand tight, so the whole thing can't come apart. And I'll get my bottom in. And get my bolts fit into place. Make sure it doesn't push my other bearing out. And we have that into place. Then we can pull down the upper arm. Make sure, oh, everything's in place. And that bolt into place. This one goes through this way, so it'll clear the rotor. And have my bearing, my bushing fall out of my, and not have a rack handy. I can put that in place and put the nut on there. I have to pull the bottom one out because I put it in the wrong way. And then we put the bottom one in the right way. And that's pushed through. And get the nut started on that. Now we'll be all set. Now we'll just have to go through and tighten everything up. Tighten our... First thing I want to do is make sure I have the right movement in my U-joints. Everything went back together right. That's all solidly on there. So now I just need to button everything back up. I'll put my my brake assembly back on, and that's what it is, taking apart and replacing the wheel bearing. It's not too complicated. You're going to have the two bolts for your top suspension, two bolts, or a bolt for your bottom suspension, bolt for your top. You can take the whole wheel assembly off, take off your castle nut. Now there's been roughly, I guess other people looked up, said this nut is torqued down to roughly about 100 foot-pounds. I'm going to go between 80 and 100 foot-pounds on it. Looking at the bearing, I guess that's probably more correct because you want to make sure that you're compressing those two bearings together properly. So we'll go to the 100 foot-pounds on that, and everything should be all good. We'll tighten everything up. We'll get the wheel back on here, and we'll take it for a ride and see how this works out.